Okay, thanks Vicky. I'll be fairly short and sweet on this, but what I thought was really important is we've had a lot of information this afternoon, and I know myself trying to get my head around the pros and cons of a whole lot of that sort of stuff is pretty challenging. And in the last couple of years I've been working on some stuff to help deciding what to do or helping to make a good decision and how we weigh up those pros and cons. And so I thought this was a great opportunity to actually test that and explain to you guys just the way I've sort of been going about trying to do that, and give you hopefully a tool that you can take home. And while it won't be perfect, it'll give you the outline of, I reckon, a good way of thinking about how to make some of these what I'd call fairly complex and pretty important decisions. I want to start just by setting the scene. First comment, just because we make decisions all the time doesn't mean we're good at making them. This came from a woman in Western Australia when I was doing a roadshow over there, and she's saying, you've given us all this information, but I really don't know how to make a good decision. And so the question to you guys is, when were you taught to make a good decision? You remember it at school? I never did it at school, I never did it at uni, never did it anywhere. We're just expected to do it. And we make hundreds of decisions a day, some of them pretty simple, you know, where you're having tea or coffee for breakfast, or what you have for breakfast. Some of these decisions though, do I write this crop off? Do I spend money on nitrogen? It's actually potentially going to cost you a fair bit of money. So I want to sort of think our way through about how do we go about making a good decision. And I want to separate the difference between what I call a good decision and a right decision. And to me, a good decision is an informed one. Okay, one that we've got as much information as we can and we consider that carefully before we make the decision. Everybody wants to make right decisions, okay? But right decisions rely on hindsight. It's after you've rolled the dice. So you think, I reckon that's right, I'll roll the dice and let's hope it works out the right way. And you look back, so gee, that was the right decision to make. Okay. As we all know, we've got to make good decisions now, or hopefully make good decisions now, and with a bit of luck and if we've done enough thinking, the odds are that they will be the right decision. And so I want to separate between what's a good decision and what's a right decision. Okay. So if we want to make a good decision, what do we have to think about? The first thing I reckon is that most decisions require more than one thing, what I've called here a critical factor, to be considered. So even today, it's not just one thing. We don't just have to think about nitrogen. We've also got to think about nitrogen and what the crop looks like. We've got to think about how long it's been waterlogged for. We've got to think about, when was it sown. We've got to think about some of the herbicides that we might have used on it. We've got to think about what are some of the options that we've got. So usually there's more than one thing that we have to consider in making this decision. The second one is that those critical factors or those things aren't always of equal importance. Some will weigh more on the decision and something else. They need to be considered, but they're not all exactly the same. The third one is, while we might like to think that our decisions are influenced by the facts and we only take the facts into account to make them, I can tell you there are three things that influence virtually every decision we make. One is the head, which is the facts part of it, but also your heart, which is your preferences and your values, what I like, what I don't like, and your past experience. Okay, so your past experience will weigh heavily on the next decision you make. Okay, it will influence it, and if we just think we only work on facts, I can tell you that you're kidding yourself, because we actually, all of those three have an influence in the decision we make. Second last one, to consider in a good decision, is that we've got to be able to put our own position on risk into it. I can tell you everybody sitting in this room will have a different position on risk. And so for some people, they will look at that crop and they'll go, it's pretty wet, just heard what Dale said, just heard what a few other people said, I'm going to take a punt and I'm going to put a heap of nitrogen on it. Someone else might be sitting with exactly the same crop in front of them and saying, no, I'm going to be far more conservative, I'm only going to put half that amount of nitrogen on because of the amount of risk I want to take or the amount of punt that I want to take. Okay? And all of those are correct. And the last one is that sometimes we need to, what I call, slow down our thinking. Sometimes we jump to conclusions very quickly, and we often jump to those conclusions because we have these things called rules of thumb that float around in our head. I did that in the past, I know the result I'm going to get, I'll do exactly the same thing next time. We just need to slow down a bit and make sure that the decision we're going to make this time and the rule of thumb that might be informing that is for a similar circumstance to what we had last time. Okay, so there are 5 things that I reckon you need to include when you're making a good decision. The way I go about those is a thing called a decision matrix. And I want to share this with you because Drummy, John Midwood and myself had a go at trying to create one of these before this talk came up. And I've heard the speakers. But we actually tried to have a crack at putting a decision matrix together, which included a whole lot of those characteristics or features I talked about in the slide before. And I want to share that with you. And I've actually got a handout of it, and I'm going to hand it out in a tick, Vicky, so I'll give it to you. But hang on to it, because I know as soon as I hand it out, everybody's going to look at the sheet and no one's going to listen to me. So I'm going to go through a couple of steps before I hand it out. And I want you to think about this not so much as the answer, but think more about the process that I use and some of the content that's in it. If you want to go home and change some of it, go for your life. Okay, it's more about the thinking behind it and how I think it could work. So, step through, there's a 7-step process. First step is to define the decision. And in this case, the decision that Drummy, John and I said is, if we walked into a paddock, the decision I've got to make is, do I apply inputs to this crop or do I write it off? Okay, I walk into it, I look at it and go, that's a decision I've got to make. And that could be paddock by paddock. Second thing we do is list the major considerations, or what I call the critical factors that should influence a decision. Now, having sitting here this afternoon, I've heard a couple of others from Rob that I would actually include in that decision now. We hadn't done anything in our consideration about what the roots look like on the crop, as another thing that I should consider in making a call and making that decision. So you'll see this one, I reckon, already is deficient in something. But what we do is we list the major considerations. Now you can hand it out, Vicky. Thank you. Because these are the 5 considerations that we came up with. Okay, it took us about, 10, 15 minutes, Drummy, probably to come up with these. And there were 5 of them. One we said was the density of healthy plants that are likely to produce grain. So it wasn't just what are the total plant numbers, but what are those plants that we think might produce grain, which to some extent might pick up what Rob was saying about are those plants healthy and do they have roots on them. The second major consideration we said is what's the crop growth stage where nitrogen can be applied? Because as Rob said, if we're applying it too late, when the demand or that critical demand has gone past, then the use of nitrogen will be, or we'll get less efficiency out of that nitrogen that we put on. 2 questions around, or critical factors around how much weed we've actually got in the crop and the potential, not only do we have weed in there, but at this time of year, what's the potential of actually being able to control those weeds or those diseases in the crop? And then the last one, which was the one Dale gave us some information on, is what's the end of season forecast? Because if we're sitting here and I know the end of season forecast is going to be, it's predicted to be the driest on record, I would think differently about the decisions I'm going to make as opposed to, well, it could be average or just a bit below average. My decision would change as a result. So they're the 5 critical factors I've got in there. You may be sitting here and think, oh, there's another critical factor. That's all right, add that in when you get home. Change it as you get home. So this is the second step, is to identify those critical factors. The third step is that for each of those critical factors, or the major things that we need to consider in making this decision, you ask yourself, at what point would I think differently about my response? And what do I mean by that? Is if we take that first critical factor around the density of healthy plants likely to produce grain, I reckon if I had adequate plant density of around about those 200 plants a square metre if it was a cereal, I would think differently about that crop and the decision I'd make about that crop as if I had less than 100 plants a square metre. Because I simply don't have enough plants there to produce yield that I would have if I've got 200 plants a square metre. Did everybody see what I've done there? Just take that critical factor and think there's a couple of points where I think differently about, or start to think differently about the decision I might make. Okay. You've probably had a look at your the handout that I've given you now. This was the one that we came up first of all about the growth stage when nitrogen can be applied. Now, if we're not applying nitrogen until our cereals are late in the growth stage 40 because we simply can't get on and get nitrogen on, I would think differently about the decision I might be making around that crop than if I can get on around this GS30, 32 stage. Okay, now your crops, different paddocks might be different stages. So for one paddock, that might be the answer. Another paddock, that might be the answer, or that might be the response. So they'll vary from paddock to paddock. Okay. That's the example you've got there. That's going through all of them. I'm not going to go through all of them in detail. I'll let you take that home and have a bit of a look at it. But that's the third step that we do. We've got these 5 critical factors, which was step 2, and then for each of those steps we divide these up. And I reckon, Drummy, what do you reckon? We spend half an hour on the phone just trying to decide where those differences would be. And when I said slow down your thinking, this is what it's doing. And I can tell you, it's pretty hard on the brain when you're sitting there thinking, when would I think differently about this? But having to actually write it is really valuable. All right, step 4 is when we start assigning scores to each of the conditions. And the hints I've got in putting these together is, first of all, you assign all the lowest conditions a 0. So if I go back to this here, any ones here that I've written as the lowest ones on that list there, I'd give them 0s. And then I complete the highest scores, but relative to other highest scores. So you know when I mentioned that not all factors, while they need to be considered, not all are of equal importance? You can change the numbers on some of those to say, I reckon this is twice as important as something else. I've got to consider both, but this is more important than something else. And then you complete your middle scores. So this is putting all the 0s in. That's where you first start when you're creating one of these. And the second thing is then you put all of your highest scores in. So you've got your 0s, you now put your highest scores in. And you'll probably see on there, we've rated the number of plants to start with as being far more important than any other of these individual factors. Because we basically concluded if you haven't got plants there in the first place, all the other stuff's almost secondary. If you've got bugger all plants there, this idea about, what's the end of season forecast doesn't really matter because you haven't got enough there to start with anyway. So we've got different values on these. And then we've filled out some other numbers in between. So that's the sheet that you've got in front of you. I'm really comfortable if you want to argue the toss on these, argue the toss on these, or argue the toss on those numbers. Because at the end of the day, the decision's got to be yours. All we've tried to do is give you an example of how this might pan out. Step 5 is in what I call decision scores. So you'll see at the bottom there's a little box there that's got decision. The way we create these is, first of all, you add up your maximum score. So if everything got the highest score out of those 5 that I've got on offer, you get 25 points. So if we all look through that and say, if I got the top rating on each of those, what decision would you make? What's that?
Don't do anything, you're doing the right thing.
Well, you're doing the right thing, yeah. So if we go to this one here, if you had adequate plant density, you can get your nitrogen on in that early growth stage. You've got minimal weed pressure or no disease, weed or disease problems, and it's going to be average rainfall. What would you do? You'd really have a crack at it, wouldn't you? Because a lot of things are stacking up in your favour. So we've got one bookend, which is if everything was perfect and stacked up, we'd really go for it. Then my suggestion is you then do the extreme at the other end. So if I went through this one here and I got all 0s, I had less than 50% plants, I couldn't get nitrogen on till growth stage 50, I've got weed pressures and the weed control, if I tried to do anything, wouldn't be much good, and it's going to be below average rainfall for the next 3 months, what do you reckon you'd do? I reckon I'd write the crop off, wouldn't you? Think about something else. So we've got 2 end points. We've got the best that could happen and the worst that could happen, which is what we've created there. And then what we did was we put some scores on that. And we said if we got above 22 points in total, we'd retain the crop and would optimise our yield potential by applying all the appropriate inputs, which is exactly what you said. That's what you do. If it was at the other end, we might abandon the crop, or we've said abandon the crop and consider other options to dry the soil profile. So the sort of stuff that Jade was talking about is the other end of that spectrum. Then we describe other possible decisions between those 2 extremes. Now sometimes I've done some of these and there's only like a yes or no answer. You do this or you do this. And it's just therefore 1 score in between. But in this one, I've got some other scores in there. And so we had 2 other decisions we reckon are possible. One is to retain the crop, but we adjust our yield expectations and apply inputs to match. So we don't go full bottle on it. We think, I reckon this is probably only going to go 3.5 tonne, therefore I'll back off on some of these things. To one that we might retain the crop because the score is lower, but only if it's a better alternative to a successful alternative spring crop or fodder option. And then the yield levels will be marginal, so inputs must be carefully thought through. So we're saying there's actually 4 decisions we could make, or 4 ways to go in making a decision. This is pretty marginal, and if we don't have a better option, yeah, we might stick at it. But let's not spend much on it. Let's be really judicious about what we spend money on. And we just have these scores accordingly. So we come up with these scores. And then the last step, which is step 6, is to test those decision scores and just run some hypothetical examples. And that's what Drummy did, that's what John did. We sat down, we played around with a few options and said, okay, that comes out with a score of about 15. Under that circumstance, I reckon I would do this. How does it stack up? And you adjust your numbers accordingly. Okay. And then, so we've got some hypothetical examples and we adjust those decisions. And so if we come back to here, that might not be 13 now, that might go up to 15. When you think, hang on, this doesn't quite sit right with my gut feel of how the decision should be. Okay, so that at the end of the day is exactly what you end up with, that thing. And that's what I call a decision matrix. Now, I've used these, I've got probably about 50 of these at home for a whole lot of circumstances, whether they're frosted crops, whether it's how much, whether you sell stock, have you got enough feed in front of you, anything to leasing country, making decisions around leasing country. I've made all of these. I reckon it is a fantastic process if you can get your head around how to use it. One of the great things I reckon is it makes you put it down on paper rather than floating around in your head. Really useful if you've got more than one person in a business, because you've got more than one person in a business, you actually see the decisions you make. It also allows you, if you want to take risk into account and you want to be more risk averse, you might say, if the maximum score is 25, I won't make that 22, I might make that 24. So in fact, everything's almost got to be perfect before I'll pull the trigger and go flat out on it. So the level of risk you want, you just change those numbers accordingly that suit you. If you want more information, the Grain and Gray's website's actually got that explanation in it in far more detail. I wrote this a couple of years ago of how to put those together. So if you just go to the Grain and Gray's 3 website, in the tools and calculators bit, that'll be in there. And on that note, I'll finish up, Vicky.
Thank you, Cam. Questions?
Cam, I mean, it's a great tool, but where do you build in the potential for economic outcome?
Yep.
The reason is that you might have an option to, say, abandon a crop and take on a spring crop, for example.
Yep.
That's of higher value. But you've got the opportunity, you can go all the way. So just the context of economic outcome.
Yeah. So I would consider that in this one here in this decision, because and actually we tossed around that whether we put what's the alternative as part of the decision in the first place. Yeah. But we decided that the first decision you've got to make is, do I hang on to this crop or do I think of something else? Then what is the option for the next one is a different decision. But this one here, retain the crop, but only if it's a better alternative to a successful alternative spring sown crop or fodder option. In there I'd be looking, hang on, this other option I've got, I could actually do much better, and therefore I'd actually not retain the crop, I'd go down this path, if that makes sense. So I'd look at it, okay, I'm sitting here, I've got 14 or 15, so I'm right on the edge there. What's the option? Hey, that's a pretty handy option. Therefore, I would ditch this because there is a better alternative. So that's where I would have factored that in.
You could have a fourth one, Cam, and that is that you don't predict.
Sorry, you don't?
That you don't predict forecasts.
Okay. No, and really good point, Brian, because I reckon if that's the way you think, I don't trust these very much. Don't put that in at all.
You talk about looking at the roots now because of the information today. Are you going to add that in as another critical factor, or are you going to add that to that first one, being the density of healthy plants?
I'll have a think of it. I reckon it'll probably go in there. Yeah. But I think part of this, instead of just adequate plant density, I think it would be plant health, particularly root appearance or something, is what I'd put in. Because I might have 200 plants, and we call them healthy plants. You know, healthy plants, however you want to define that. We sort of had that in mind, but what Rob's just talked about in the slides you put up there. I thought, that's a great way of doing it.
One last question, thank you.
Yeah, again, do you ever find that as you go through the process that the initial question has to be changed? That you have to think about it?
Yep. Yes. Yeah. Because sometimes when I said the first step is define the question, as you start going through this, you think, hang on, that's not really the question I need to answer, as you start thinking about it. And so you do change that question. Yeah. What you've just touched on, though, is the cycles that you go through as you think through this. This is what I call slowing down your thinking. So instead of jumping to a conclusion because we reckon, oh, that's what we've done in the past, that's what we'll always do, all of a sudden you've had to think about it. And you go, oh, hang on, that question's not right. Yeah, and I can tell you that first question I had, what was it, I'm giving mine away, here we go. So what's the question? Do I apply inputs to this crop or write it off? That was the third iteration. So I'd actually written two different, this is what my decision is, and I thought, no, the decision is really about, do I spend money on this or do I write it off?